Hello and welcome to the next talk of our talk series. Today we have Mark Musen, who will talk about semantic technology and science, enhancing data stewardship in support of new discovery. So where did you just switch to? Well, it's our talk series on knowledge graph research that has had a few talks already, and we will continue to organize that. Who is organizing it? It's the Cost Action on Distributed Knowledge Graphs. It's a European research network in collaboration with the Semantic Web Science Association, who is running, for instance, the ISWC conference. What is this research network doing? It's organizing workshop hackathons and scientific exchange until September of this year. It's chaired by myself, together with Axel Polleres, Michel de Montier, Andreas Hart, Ramzi Celebi, Antoine Zimmermann, Olaf Hartig, John McCree, Anastasia Dimou, and Stefan Gostojic. Today we have Mark Musen speaking, and I would like to hand over to Olaf to introduce the speaker.
Hello, welcome from my side as well. Our speaker today is Mark Musen. He's a professor of medical informatics research at Stanford University. And his research is related to a lot of different things, including open science, intelligent systems, computational ontologies, biomedical decision support. Many of you may have come across the ontology building framework Protégé. That one was developed by Mark's group at Stanford. Another well-known outcome of his work is the bioportal ontology registry, which is an outcome of the National Center for Biomedical Ontology in the US, for which Mark was the principal investigator. Nowadays, he directs the Center for Expanded Data Annotation and Retrieval, which develops semantic technology to ease the authoring and management of experimental metadata. He received a bunch of different awards, including the Donald Lindbergh Award for Innovation in Informatics from the American Medical Information Association. And then in 2014, he received, together with his co-authors, the 10-year award of SWISR for a paper that was published in 2004. And that one was about the OWL plugin for Protégé. So we asked Mark to give kind of a talk about, to kind of reminisce a bit on the work that was done at the time and how this has evolved towards our challenges that we have today. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Olaf. I appreciate it. Let me just share my screen. Hope you're seeing that appropriately.
No, you have to swap displays again.
Once again, there we go.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, well, it's really exciting to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation to give this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about what led to the SWISR Award 10 years ago for work that was done 10 years prior to that, and give you the impression, I hope, that a lot has happened in 20 years and give you a sense for where I think my contribution to the field is going and why I think this kind of work is really critically important. I think what's exciting for me is just the real blossoming of AI as an area of excitement just in the lay press and in the everyday world. There's just a new excitement about AI that I haven't seen in a long time. The last time I saw this thrill about AI was when I was a graduate student, and this article from a publication from the National Institutes of Health in the United States from 1979 sort of was at the height of the knowledge-based system or expert system craze, which was in full force when I was a graduate student. I don't know what's going on in this image. It seems to be a medical expert who has his neurons being directly interfaced with a bunch of integrated circuits attached to a mag tape drive. But in any event, it gives you a sense for really the thrill that people had about AI now 40 years ago, and that I'm seeing coming back now, certainly with the area in the area of knowledge graphs. But what I want to do is sort of relate what's going on now in the work that I'm involved in with some of the stuff that was going on at this very early stage in the popularization of artificial intelligence. And at the time when people were building expert systems, basically there was this prevailing paradigm where people thought of knowledge engineers being the modelers who would interact with subject matter experts and create a knowledge base. And that knowledge base ostensibly was a way of taking what an expert knew about an area of interest, a professional activity that was important to automate, and to create a knowledge base that would contain the knowledge, presumably, that those subject matter experts had and used in their professional activities. And this model of transfer of knowledge from subject matter experts to knowledge engineers to knowledge base may not really reflect what was happening in terms of real interactions, but is an important metaphor. And I'm going to come back to this later in the talk, so don't let the slide go away. My early work really was in trying to make this whole process more efficient and basically create a foundation for knowledge bases that I think was more valuable than the usual soup of rules, which was the prevailing way in which people created knowledge bases when I was in graduate school. And that led to the development of Protege, which many of you are familiar with. This is a version of Protege circa 2000, which is frankly probably the version that made the system most popular, that led to the publication for which we received the Swizza Award. And Protege was one of the first editors for OWL and still is probably the most widely used editor for OWL, and became a basis for building ontologies, which obviously has been incredibly important for the knowledge graph community. But at the time that Protege was created, it was initially developed to build knowledge-based systems. And I'm not going to go into all of that work, but you can see easily how being able to define knowledge in terms of ontologies created a structure for knowledge bases which was much more tractable than having a whole bunch of rules that are just thrown together in an unordered list. What I want to talk about really is where things have gone in the past 20 years and where my group is now. And what I want to do is just tell you a story. This is a guy named Pravesh Khatri, who is a professor on the Stanford faculty who works with me. And Pravesh calls himself a data parasite. He's a data parasite because he's a guy who does really exciting biological research, but he doesn't generate his own data. What he does is to go online and he studies other people's data. It's particularly in the area of biology called gene expression. About 20 years ago, people recognized that they could put on a chip the DNA for all the genes in a particular organism, and using stains and mechanisms that will cause those stains to fluoresce, it's possible to see how genes get turned on and turned off over time. And these chips led to a whole area of research called functional genomics. And the results of these microarrays, these chips that have all these genes on them, are stored in the United States in a resource which is called the Gene Expression Omnibus, big database managed by the NIH. And the Gene Expression Omnibus basically is a place to go to find the results of almost any experiment done in the US involving gene microarrays. And you can search GEO or the Gene Expression Omnibus and come up with all kinds of studies. And this is exactly what Pravesh does. He goes to the Gene Expression Omnibus, studies other people's data, and he's done remarkable stuff. He's been able to identify how genes can be used to identify the onset of sepsis, where you have serious blood pressure problems and other kinds of manifestations of infection. He has developed a mechanism for identifying gene signatures for TB, and now has a new kind of diagnostic test, which has been promoted by WHO as the basis for identifying active TB cases. And he can use gene expression signatures to distinguish viral from bacterial respiratory infection. He can understand when there might be rejection of an organ transplant. He's done really remarkable stuff. And he's never walked into a lab. He's never touched a pipette. He basically studies other people's data. And there's been this real revolution in science where people are now trying to use the existing data sets put in online repositories as the basis for being able to basically make new advances in science. And in fact, there's a conference called the Pacific Symposium on Biocomputing that gives a Parasite Award for that year's best set of papers that reflect the ability to go online and use other people's data to make new discoveries. Very, very exciting change in the way we do science. The problem is, you can be a data parasite only if you have data that are in some public repository, if the data can be found through some kind of a search facility, if they're retrievable in a standard format, if they're self-describing, if people have thought about the idea of making their data available to others, and the idea that the data will be reused, they will outlive the experiment for which they were collected, they will outlive the lifetime of the investigator. And basically what has happened is a recognition that most data sets, almost all data sets out there, are not in that situation. Basically, most archive data sets fail these tests. And that's a problem because Horizon Europe is insisting that investigators put their data online and those data be accessible and reusable. The Office of Science and Technology Policy in the US has made a similar requirement. Last year, the National Institutes of Health in the US implemented a data sharing policy, which has suddenly gotten people very concerned about how to make their data accessible. And people are recognizing that we have to do more than just put data in a database. We have to make them useful. And that sort of harkens back to a paper that appeared almost 10 years ago, where people recognized that what we really want to do is to make data what they called fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And the idea of fair data has just taken over the scientific community really by storm. And it's just unbelievable. Everybody now wants to make their data fair. Everybody is saying that fair data are the way that we're going to make data available online. Fair data are the way that we're going to have secondary analyses leading to new discoveries. The problem is almost all data out there, despite the claims, aren't fair. And what really makes the data fair are the guiding principles that the FAIR community have articulated. Now, we're not going to go through them all. No one really ever remembers them. But what I do want you to remember is that the guiding principles for FAIR data really deal with metadata. And they really are talking about how the metadata that describe the scientific data sets that people put in online repositories need to be rich. They need to adhere to community standards. They need to be able to adhere to those standards so that people can search for those data. People, once they retrieve the data, can know what the experiments were that people actually did and use those data in new ways. The problem is that the metadata in public repositories aren't fair. In fact, they're a mess, because investigators view their primary objective to be publishing papers, not to be leaving a legacy of fair data. Sponsors require data sharing, but they don't always encourage the use of their own funds to pay for it. And creating metadata is really hard. And when you look in public repositories and see what people store as metadata to describe the data that they're archiving, it's a joke. This is I won't say it's a completely randomly selected example, but this is a metadata record from a repository that is managed by the National Institutes of Health in the United States called Biosample. And what you can see is that there are attributes and values. And so we can view a metadata record as a set of attribute value pairs. But in this particular record, we see the disease being SLE, and SLE is not a standard abbreviation, though presumably it means systemic lupus. Disease stage is given as new onset, which is not a standard way of describing disease stage. And we see the karyotype is not given in terms of actual chromosome descriptions, but just as the total number of chromosomes. This is obviously not useful. Here's another record where we see the isolate is missing with an apostrophe. The age is missing. Here's another example where the sex is given as W. I'm not sure what sex W is, presumably woman. And we see just lots of information, but how to make sense of this is just, anybody's guess. Here's another one where the disease name is not even in English, where the attribute hereditary way, I don't know what hereditary way means, and I don't know what the value 1.AD means. And here the specimen has an altitude. I'm not sure what the altitude of a data set would be. Basically, you see attributes which don't make sense, values which don't make sense. And in fact, when we've looked at repositories like Biosample carefully, we see that 73% of the metadata values that are supposed to be Boolean are not really true or false. 26% of the integers can't be parsed as integers. 68% of the values that are supposed to come from ontologies don't come from ontologies. And so basically, the data are not fair, the data are not searchable, and if you're a data parasite like Pravesh Khatri, it's really, really hard to look at other people's data, find the data says that you need, and to be able to make new discoveries on the basis of other data that people put online. Basically, if we want to have fair data, if we want to be able to use data in ways which allow us to do exciting things, we need ontologies that provide controlled terms for the values in those data, in those metadata. We need reporting guidelines that provide standardization for the structure of the metadata. We need technology to make it easy to author good metadata, and we need procedures that create community-based standards in the first place. And my team in the past few years has been trying to address each of these problems. Let's look at the ontology problem first. I mentioned gene expression omnibus is the place where Pravesh gets most of his data sets. Go to Geo and you look at the records, you try to find records that talk about the age of the subject, and you don't just see age, you see age and age and age and pop age and age after birth, and a gazillion ways in which people can describe age. If you're a scientist trying to search for a data set that deals with subjects of a certain age, you have to anticipate all the possible ways in which people could have described the age of their subject. You have to anticipate all the possible spelling errors and typos, and it basically makes it really, really hard to find the data that you're after. We need mechanisms to get access to stuff in ontologies, put them into our metadata, and as Olaf mentioned, at Stanford, we've been working on a repository called BioPortal, which allows us to basically put online all of the publicly available ontologies in biomedicine, and now in other areas of science as well, so that people can get access to ontologies programmatically through an API and visually through a web browser, and understand exactly how ontologies are used. Here, for example, we can see how the foundational model of anatomy has been released over time, and basically how often it gets visited, how many people seem to be using it, as well as metrics about that ontology that give us some understanding of how well it's been constructed. And we can also browse the ontology online and get access to it. And basically, BioPortal provides a really important mechanism by which we could, if we were so inclined, have controlled terms that give us standardized metadata that are more searchable and that would give us data sets that are more fair. We need reporting guidelines. And what does that mean? Well, 20 years ago, people in the microarray community that I mentioned recognized that if they're going to put their data online, they have to have metadata that allow people to understand what the experiment was. What was the substrate? What microarray platform was used? What were the experimental conditions? How could somebody replicate the experiment? And the microarray community created something called Miami, the minimal information about a microarray experiment, which was a textual checklist of all the things that metadata about a microarray experiment needed to include in order for the metadata to be useful and therefore for the data to be fair. And in biology, this kind of thing has caught on like wildfire. So now you find metadata guidelines like MIATA, minimal information about T-cell assays, minimal information in the annotation of biochemical models, or Miriam, MiniMES, MISFISHY, and just all kinds of guidelines that define what are the things you need to say about an experiment and its data for someone to make sense of the data that are stored online and what are needed to make those data fair. And so we need ontologies that provide the controlled terms. We need reporting guidelines that tell us what are the ways in which we want to structure the attribute value pairs in our metadata. And with this kind of information, we can get a lot done if our goal is to reuse experimental data. And so we need technology that takes advantage of ontologies and reporting guidelines that makes it easy to author good metadata in the first place and to take advantage of those data sets. So I'm going to tell you about two pieces of technology that we've been building that basically take advantage of the kind of work we've been doing in our laboratory now for several decades. The first is called the CEDAR Workbench. That's an editor that helps research create standards-compliant metadata from ontologies and reporting guidelines. And indeed, you can view the output of CEDAR as a small knowledge graph that captures what you need to say about a data set in order for someone to make sense of it. I'll also tell you about the CEDAR Metadata Validator, which is a separate piece of technology that takes advantage of templates created for use with CEDAR and allows us to validate information which is not authored using CEDAR, but can verify whether metadata actually adhere to the standards that the template might capture. Let's talk about the CEDAR Workbench first. Basically, you can view the Workbench as involving 3 steps. On the left, we provide a mechanism whereby we can author metadata templates, so communities of investigators who decide what their reporting guidelines should be and what ontologies they want to use have an editor that allows them to create a template for the metadata that will describe a kind of experiment used by a kind of community of investigators. They author the template, and then in the middle, you see the system that allows a scientist who has just done an experiment to create metadata for his or her data set, filling in that template in a way which ensures that the metadata that are associated with the data set adhere to the standards that are captured in the metadata template that was just authored. And then we can upload the metadata as defined in that middle box with the data set into a repository like Geo or Import or any of the other things that you see on the right of the screen. The other thing that we do is we create a repository ourselves of all the metadata that have been authored with CEDAR. And that repository gives us a resource that we can use to look at patterns in the metadata and to associate with those patterns information that allows us to enhance the authoring of metadata in the first place. So if we see that there are patterns that are traditionally associated with different kinds of data sets, we can make predictions about the data, the metadata that will be entered through the metadata editor, and we can hopefully expedite the acquisition of those metadata. So here's what CEDAR looks like. There's a library of a set of metadata templates. Suppose we're interested in the template for the biosample repository at the NCI, or rather the NCBI, the National Center for Biotechnology Information, and we want to populate it. Well, we make the selection from the menu, and here's what the template looks like. We can see that biosample has a set of attributes. This is the reporting guideline for data that would go into biosample. There's a sample name, an organism, a tissue, sex, isolate, and so on. And if we want to fill out this template in the metadata editor, we can start entering values. We can say the sample has a number like 56. The organism is Homo sapiens, which might be a selection from a particular ontology. And here we're entering the tissue. And we see that the tissue can be one of a number of elements from a drop-down list. In this case, because the template designer has said that the tissue needs to be described using a term from an ontology called Uberon, which is an ontology that describes anatomy, we can make a selection from this drop-down list, and we're guaranteed that the value for the tissue will be a valid element of the Uberon ontology. More important, because we have that repository of previously entered metadata, we can reason about that, the patterns in those metadata, and we know that when the organism is Homo sapiens, the most likely selection for tissue is going to be blood, and that the next most likely selection for tissue is going to be liver. And so the drop-down list doesn't necessarily give you a whole bunch of unordered selections that may be difficult to sort through, but we sort them in advance in accordance with what we anticipate will be the most likely selections that a user might want to make. And so we can really expedite the selection of these elements from the drop-down and make it really easy to fill out this web form. And so what's happening behind the scenes is that we've created a template that defines the reporting guideline for biosample. We have started to fill in this template by making selections from ontologies. And what CEDAR is doing is creating a JSON description of the metadata, which you can view as a knowledge graph that describes what we need to know about the experiment, or in this case, the sample being described for this particular repository, that is parsable, that is adherent to a rigid semantics where everything is just defined in terms of ontologies, and where we know that these selections follow the standards that a particular scientific community has adopted, in this case, for describing samples that are coming from humans. And what really gets us excited is that lots of people are now using the CEDAR Workbench. We're seeing CEDAR being adopted by a variety of NIH consortia. We're seeing a number of generalist data repositories like Dryad and OSF that are used in the scientific community to manage these online data, using CEDAR as the mechanism by which users are able to describe their metadata in a standard way, adherent to the ways in which various scientific communities have decided their metadata need to be, or rather their data sets need to be annotated. So that's the CEDAR Workbench, basically allowing you to define templates for metadata, filling in those templates, and making those templates available for researchers who want to be able to search and integrate metadata into their work. The CEDAR metadata validator is a separate technology that also uses the same CEDAR templates. So we have a collaboration with a large consortium that is funded by the National Institutes of Health in the US called the Human Biomolecular Atlas Program, or HUBMAP. And HUBMAP is basically trying to create an atlas of every cell type in the human body and identifying what are all the markers, all the biomarkers that would allow you to identify each individual cell. So it's basically amalgamating data from myriad experiments, trying to identify what are the genes, what are the proteins, what are the lipids, what are the other kind of biomarkers that characterize one cell and distinguish it from other types of cells. And we were very excited because we're working with HubMap. We've created CEDAR templates for all the kinds of studies that are in HubMap. And as you see, just as in the case of biosample, we have attribute value pairs, we have defined data types, we have value sets or ontologies that are being used on a regular basis to make sure that the metadata describing these assays are standardized and adherent to whatever standards the various scientific communities have endorsed. That's all the good news. The bad news is that the HubMap community doesn't like web forms. The HubMap community likes spreadsheets. And they said, we'll do anything we can to use your approach, but we're not interested in filling out web forms. We want to use spreadsheets to do basically the same kind of work. Well, that's okay, except when you fill out a spreadsheet, spreadsheets are prone to errors like missing fields and formatting problems. The ability to validate entries into a tool like Excel are pretty limited. And basically, it's really hard to deal with spreadsheets as the first-class representation of metadata and anticipate that you can easily rectify problems. So what we've developed is a tool which basically allows us to have investigators input their spreadsheets and use CEDAR's description of metadata templates that capture the standard reporting guidelines for particular communities and use those templates as a basis for evaluating and managing data that are entered through the spreadsheets. So basically, here's what an investigator in the HubMap project might do is to use the spreadsheet to fill in the information, but this is not just an ordinary Excel spreadsheet. What we have done is use the template entered into the CEDAR template library to generate this template such that the headings in each of the columns represent the attributes in a particular reporting guideline for a kind of metadata. And whenever possible, we can actually import into the spreadsheet the aspects of the appropriate ontology for the values for that corresponding attribute, so that people fill out the spreadsheet and they can use the ontologies that are linked to which the reporting guideline links in BioPortal to make sure that things are adherent to the standards to the degree possible. But we know that people will screw up. We know that the spreadsheet will not always have the information that needs to be captured, and that people can actually make errors. So we have a validator. And what happens in the HubMap project is that people drag their spreadsheet into the validator. The validator knows what reporting guideline is being used, knows what ontologies to use, because those are all captured in the metadata template that is associated with the spreadsheet. And user says, start validating. And what we see is a report that immediately appears where you can see that for the spreadsheet that was just entered, 13 of the metadata entries are totally valid, whereas 20 have problems. And what we can do is we can start looking at the errors and we can start repairing them. We can analyze the spreadsheet data. We can see where there are invalid metadata records, and we can see where users have obviously made mistakes or overwritten the recommendations that the spreadsheet would ordinarily enforce to require adherence to standards. And most important, the validator makes suggestions about how to change the spreadsheet values so that they are adherent to the standards that are required by the template, and users have the ability to either accept or reject those suggestions. And then those values get uploaded to the facility where hub map data are ingested. So here's an example where we have a separate application that uses as a resource the metadata template for a kind of experiment and allows users who want to use spreadsheets to be able to validate those spreadsheets and determine that the metadata actually are adherent to standards in a way which will make the data fair. So we've talked about the CEDAR Workbench, which allows us to help researchers to create metadata from scratch using ontologies and reporting guidelines, and the validator, which allows us to take metadata that are entered through spreadsheets and ensure that they're valid when compared to the CEDAR templates. So if you will, a template in CEDAR is a kind of knowledge base. It's a knowledge base that captures a particular scientific community's preferences for what metadata need to be included in any description of a particular class of data set. It includes that community's beliefs about what ontologies are most appropriate to provide standard terms for those metadata. It captures that information in a reusable, standardized form, and it can be used by people to be able to review, enhance, or build on those preferences. So people can look at an existing metadata description in CEDAR and decide they want to enhance it for a particular new kind of experiment. They can use it to trace over time how a particular community has thought about standardizing metadata. But most important, these templates are used by machines to assist in authoring metadata or validating metadata or other kinds of applications that we build. And so if you will, you can view the template as a kind of knowledge base, but this is not a knowledge base of expertise as we may have created 40 years ago, but instead is a knowledge base of a scientific community's preferences about how data should be described so that data can be fair, and so research parasites like Pravesh Khatri can get access to the data and make new discoveries. And that really is, I think, for me, very exciting. What's also very reminiscent of what we were doing 40 years ago is the idea that we're now seeing the creation of what are called metadata for machines workshops. So the GoFair organization, the not-for-profit that is based in the Netherlands that grew out of the European Open Science Cloud, has been really promoting the idea of standardized metadata as a mechanism to make data sets fair. And what the GoFair organization has been doing, it has been having very intensive workshops where they bring together subject matter experts in a particular area of science, and they work with them to develop reporting guidelines that will capture information about the experiments that these scientists do, and ontologies that will be used to describe within the reporting guidelines standardized ways for talking about what are those elements that are described. So basically, you can view these as knowledge acquisition sessions where the GoFair organization has been really busy creating metadata descriptions in a standardized form through an interactive group process. And these metadata templates that emerge from these metadata for machines workshops are useful for various areas of science and various classes of experiments within those areas of science. And ultimately, they get rendered as metadata templates in CEDAR. And what's really interesting is that the Dutch Organization for Health Research and Development, which is called ZonMV, has really gotten religion about fair data and open science. They have hosted many of these metadata for machines workshops working with their grantees, developing the controlled terminologies and the templates needed for all of its funded research related to COVID. And the outcome of these metadata machines workshops are CEDAR templates that can be used by these investigators to ensure that their metadata adhere to the standards that ZonMV is requiring. And indeed, these standards are not just recommended. ZonMV basically says if you want to be funded, you must use these standards in order to receive our money. And so this is a really interesting example of where a funder is using its leverage to ensure not only that investigators are trying to create metadata that are adherent to standards, but are doing so using an open process that ultimately leads to the creation of knowledge graphs that capture the metadata standards and the metadata preferences in a way which they can be used by CEDAR and by other kinds of technologies. So if you will, what's happening in one of these Go Fair metadata for machines workshops is that you have template modelers who interact with subject matter experts to create a metadata template. They're not building knowledge bases of the kind that you would imagine were the kind of which we created for expert systems, but really very limited, relatively small scale descriptions of preferences relating to the way in which metadata should be described in order for data to be fair. But I think it's really interesting because it's really a rebirth of the paradigm that many of us experienced a very long time ago, a paradigm that really led to the emergence of the semantic web and to the current rebirth of knowledge graphs, suddenly making a comeback in terms of the way that we think about metadata, the way we think about open science, and the way we think about making data sets available for secondary analysis. So really, these metadata templates really can be thought about in the same terms as the knowledge bases that we created in the 1980s. They capture knowledge of a professional community, but in this case, we're talking about knowledge of preferred metadata standards. They help the community to codify its knowledge in a public, inspectable, editable place. So basically, we take what had previously been informal or at best represented in text, putting it into a public forum where it becomes available for people who want to encode new data sets and for data parasites like Pravesh Khatri who want to reuse existing data sets. And ideally, these templates can plug and play with a variety of software systems, and they allow scientific communities to be able to reuse this knowledge over and over again. And so we're seeing basically a paradigm that I certainly thought had gone out of fashion long ago, coming back in a new form, in this case, for the purposes of creating open science. And so basically, if our goal is to make data fair, if our goal is to make it possible for research parasites to take advantage of existing data sets created by other investigators and to reuse those data to make new discoveries, then basically we need to have community-endorsed metadata standards in all areas of science. And that's hard because we really need to provide mechanisms to encourage scientific communities to build the standards, to create the templates, to create the guidelines that are necessary to allow their metadata to be accessible in a standardized form. But that's coming. We see funders like ZonMV who are insisting on it, and I think over time we're going to see a lot more of this kind of activity. We need technology like CEDAR to help create those standards adherent metadata in the first place. We need technology like the metadata validator that allows people who don't want to use something as rigid as a web form to be able to know that their metadata ultimately are standards adherent. And really, we need a concerted effort on the part of funders, publishers, professional societies, investigators, all of us, to stimulate the creation of the standards that are needed to advance science, because ultimately there's just too much work to be done. There are too many people who want to take advantage of not only their own data sets, but other people's data sets. And that's not going to happen until we have easy mechanisms in place in order to standardize metadata and retrieve metadata in a way which makes us confident that we're actually finding the data sets that we're looking for. So data will not be fair until funding agencies enforce their requirements for open science and data sharing. They will not be fair until publishers demand that metadata be adherent to standards so that data become accessible. Investigators feel some modicum of peer pressure to actually make their data fair, but that's happening. And academic institutions deem the sharing of fair data to be an essential component of scholarship. We need to move beyond simple bibliometrics as a way of measuring scholarly productivity and recognizing that sharing data, and more important, sharing data in a way that is fair, is really an essential component of scholarship. And really, we need to see professional societies taking the lead in helping their constituents create the standards that are needed for community-based access to metadata in a fashion that allows the data sets to be reused for all kinds of purposes. So that's going to take a lot of work, and I don't want to downplay how much work it will be to create the culture shift that is going to be needed for us to move beyond H-indexes and our publications. But ultimately, when we start to see data sharing as an important component of scholarship, we're going to see a real shift in the way that we do science. And in the meantime, what's really exciting to me is that semantic technology really, I think, has a key role to play in making data fair, in enabling third parties to find and access other people's data so they can actually make new analyses, and basically allowing these data parasites that are emerging to make the kinds of new discoveries that I think ultimately are going to allow us to make science advance at a much faster pace. And we thank you again for inviting me and to share what I've been working on, and looking forward to your comments and your thoughts.
Okay. Well, thank you for that talk. We have a technical problem, that is the noise canceling nowadays is so good. When we stop clapping, as we did in this call, the speaker doesn't hear it anymore because the noise canceling considered it as noise. But in any case, here is my try. So thank you for that very nice talk. There are a few questions on the chat already, so please keep them coming in. And if we run out of questions on the YouTube chat, the audience has to bear with my questions. So let's start. There's a question from Andreas asking, do you see a chance to extend these metadata descriptions to exclude descriptions of methods and materials of experience, and maybe ultimately the results itself?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, by the time this movement is over, the PDF publication is going to be viewed as almost a secondary product of research. The primary product of research are the data. And I think we're going to see increasingly that people will want to have information about their experiments in a machine processable form. And what will really matter is not the PDF, but what we can record in the metadata that include not only just a description of the results, but also the experimental methods, that include everything that you would actually find in the published paper, but in a form that is machine processable. I mean, frankly, what will really make this kind of work exciting is to have intelligent agents of the kind that the semantic web community talked about 20 years ago, that are able to go online, find papers, explain them, understand how papers, and I'm talking about papers in a metaphorical sense, how those data sets can inform future research, how people can do new experiments based on analysis of the metadata that are in machine processable form. I think all that is going to happen. And it's going to mean that the metadata described in knowledge graph technologies will have much more importance than the PDF.
Okay, so how many years do you give this development?
Oh,
okay.
That's a hard
question. So there's a question from Deborah asking, can CEDAR be used for non-medical data sharing on databases that are not public at the start?
Yes. And I mean, obviously, all my examples are biomedical because I'm in a school of medicine and all my funding comes from the National Institutes of Health. But we already have people who are interested in using this kind of technology in other areas of science. And the fact that it's now available in Dryad and OSF and other what they call generalist data repositories means that other areas of research will start taking advantage of it. The challenge is that the biologists, by and large, have been really the most active in creating scientific ontologies and creating metadata standards. And they lead by far other areas of science. And so that's where they have the best examples. But I think ultimately we'll see everybody else catching up.
Okay, so how much adoption do you see that the people need for transferring it to a different field or to the enterprise or something like that? Do they complain that CEDAR is too biocentric?
There's nothing biocentric in CEDAR.
Okay.
The CEDAR templates are authored through a generic editing system. The ontologies are stored in BioPortal, but there are versions of BioPortal that are now working in a variety of domains. So there's a group of investigators who form what we're calling the OntoPortal Alliance, where OntoPortal is the domain-independent version of BioPortal. And people are using OntoPortal for ecology, for agronomy, for material science, for all kinds of areas of science. And so there's really nothing that ties us to biomedicine at all.
Okay.
But don't tell that to my funders.
Okay. I hope they're not listening. So there's another question from Hilmar, who I think he observes a similar kind of development around the machine learning community with dataset cards on Hugging Face and these things. Are you aware of that, or can you put that into context?
Well, I think the machine learning community certainly recognizes the importance of metadata for the kinds of data on which learning is taking place. And there have been discussions of data sheets for, if you will, for the kinds of data that are important for that community. I think we talk about experimental metadata because for me, this is an area which I find particularly exciting. But basically, metadata are important for all kinds of digital objects, and people are creating standards for metadata to describe collections of data for machine learning, metadata for software, metadata for almost anything. And so the kinds of stuff that we're doing in CEDAR really could be extended to anything that requires a machine understandable description. And so I'd like to think that the kind of work that we're doing really will have applicability well beyond just science.
Okay. So there's a question about the biomedical domain and its difference in a way, because there's a guy named Paul saying that he is in a different field, PLM, and after decades of effort, including DoD recommendations and purchasing mandates, schema standardization seems to have not worked for them, although it did for like your biomedical community. So do they have the better enforcement mechanisms, or what is your recommendation for mandates or enforcement if people want to have these kinds of successes in other domains of research?
That's a great question. And as it often happens in our business, the greatest challenges are cultural and not technical. I think in biology, this approach has been very successful for a number of reasons. When people started to publish information about experiments using DNA microarrays that would have on a chip 25,000 genes that are turned on and off over time, well, no publisher wants to have a manuscript in a journal that describes what happens with 25,000 genes over time as a table. That's just impossible. And so people had to move that information online, but they had to move the information online in a way which made the experiments interpretable. And so there's a lot of pressure because the publisher said you really need to use a standard way of describing your experiments, and that led to the Miami standard. People wanted to be published, they had to adopt the standard. We're seeing what's happening in the Netherlands with ZonMV. If you want funding, you need to have your data available openly, and you have to use the standards that are being developed in these metadata for machine workshops. So publishers can push a community, funders can push a community, and I think in biology there's certainly now peer pressure that scientists increasingly recognize that by making their data adherent to standards, those data become more valuable. And so I think even within the community itself, even without those external carrots and sticks, you're seeing a desire to adhere to standards. But that requires work. And I can see in other areas of activity, people may not want to do the extra work, and they may not have the external pressure to do so.
Okay. Do you happen to know, like the words you were using, they oscillated between mandating and enforcement. So do you know where are the Dutch on that spectrum, or where do people need to be for a community to actually do it? Do they need to, you need to return your grant if you haven't followed the rules, or what is the useful level?
Well, in the Netherlands, unless you agree to use the standard, you don't get the money in the first place.
Okay.
So that's a pretty strong mechanism of enforcement. Similarly, if you don't adhere to the standards, you don't get your paper published in certain areas. So those are pretty strong. I've spoken to my colleagues at NIH, and they are absolutely certain they will never enforce standards that way, because they just can't imagine enforcing these kinds of regulations in a way which would put such a burden on their scientists. I mean, there's a real challenge, because many of these repositories where the data ultimately gets stored are eager to have the data submitted. And so there's a very low bar for getting your data into some of these repositories, and there's no enforcement of whether the metadata adhere to standards at all, because many of these repositories would rather just have the data in any form at all than not have data. And so there's really, again, it all comes down to the sociology of the community and what is valued and what people are willing to enforce.
Okay. I have a question about your parasite. So you said the metadata is a mess, and the data to get in the data into the portal is hard. So what is his answer? Is he looking in the light under the lamppost? So for those who are beautiful, or does he do the data massaging until it's sufficiently beautiful? So what is his stance at that?
He does the latter. And I'm almost embarrassed to say that Pravesh's approach is to hire lots of graduate students who he gives the task of going through the data and trying to second guess what was really intended in the metadata, so that he has more beautiful metadata from which to work. That's really an onerous job to give to a graduate student, but many of them are willing to do almost anything for pizza.
Fair enough. Maybe in that direction. So you said that guy doesn't need pipettes. The parasite doesn't need pipettes in the lab.
Right.
And the other day, the NVIDIA CEO said we don't need to do programming anymore. So all the grad students are don't have work anymore. So what is the skill that we actually need?
Well, I think increasingly we're going to need computation. I mean, it's obviously someone's going to have to do the pipetting, but I think as the amount of data online explodes, there are going to be just so many opportunities for people to apply computational approaches to online data. And particularly as the metadata describing experiments, as you suggest, become richer and describe more about the experiment in a way which actually begins to mimic the kind of depth that we would find in the published paper. What's going to really matter is going to be what we can do computationally. So I think this community has a bright future in terms of what's going to happen in terms of scientific analysis.
Okay. Maybe a more technical question. So your talk started out with OWL, right?
Yeah.
And then you were describing like your workbench and the metadata validator and so on. So you started out with a standard. What is the role of standards, like technical standards, general purpose, knowledge representation, validation, whatever standards, in the tools that you're building?
I think standards are critical at that level as well. So all of the metadata templates that are in CEDAR are initially authored in JSON, which we can convert to RDF. We think that's really important, and that's not going to change.
So you don't see like more shape-based approaches required, or whatever they are currently standardizing?
Well, I mean, remember the work on CEDAR began about 10 years ago, so that those technologies didn't exist. So we're kind of locked in that way. I think there would obviously would be advantages to making the representation of our underlying metadata richer. And we'd like to be able to do that, but at the same time, we're kind of, as in any situation that depends on standards, in a situation where we have a lot of users out there and a lot of dependencies that we have to deal with as well.
Okay. There's one question on the chat, and I guess maybe we get towards an end now. There's Paul says, one wave of scientific advance involves redefining of terms or introducing new concepts in like a paradigm shift way. So how does the whole approach that is applied in the biomedical domain cater for these paradigm shifts or redefining of terms or thinking completely out of the box?
That's a great question. And although CEDAR's been around for some 10 years, we haven't had the kinds of radical paradigm shifts that have gotten us into trouble yet. But certainly that will happen. And what that means is that scientific communities need to rethink what they describe about their experiments. They need to basically consider new kinds of experiments, and that requires new kinds of metadata. So I think, frankly, although the idea that science is always evolving can sometimes seem off-putting, we have an actual solution in that if we can create standards that then adhere to those new paradigms, we have a mechanism by which we can describe experiments in those new paradigms in a way which makes those data useful. What that means, of course, is that our legacy data are always going to be problematic. And obviously, there are ways in which we thought about science maybe 20 or 30 years ago, which have changed. And those data sets will require people to sort of use the old standards and think about the ways in which scientists of that era may have thought about their work as they try to access old data. That's unavoidable. But at least going forward, we know that we have a flexible mechanism whereby the way we describe data is embedded in an editable knowledge graph that we can always change.
Okay. Maybe last question, looking into the future as well. We talked about paradigm shifts, that the H index doesn't matter anymore, and all metadata is beautiful. Have you seen? So I'm a junior, or I'm turning gray, but I'm considered junior, right? So have you seen hiring committees at large considering like not the H index, but the beautiful metadata and the datasets output and so on? Is that already happening?
It's already happening. At Stanford, for example, we are I won't say this is policy right now, but we are investigating a new format for CVs at the time of appointments and promotion that would include not only bibliographic entries, but also information about data that have been created and shared. And it will take time because obviously the people who are chairing appointments and promotions committee have a lot more gray than either of us. But I think eventually the world is going to shift. It has to.
Okay. On that note, I think these are very good last words for today. I want to say thank you again. Thanks for your answers. I can only look into the future as well, into the next edition of this talk series. So we have Peter Patel-Schneider coming up on 17th of April, which you can see on our website once it's running again. You can find us on this thing formerly called Twitter. I would say cite and subscribe, and thank you very much again for this very interesting talk and all your insights.